Popular, well-known talk show host Larry King was once asked, if you could select any one person across all of history to interview, who would it be? Mr. King's answer was that he would like to interview Jesus Christ. When the questioner followed with, "And what would you like to ask him?" King replied, "I'd like to ask him if he was indeed virgin born." The answer to that question would define history for me. The account of Jesus' birth is truly remarkable. I think we can agree that if Jesus was born of a virgin, then it definitely defines history. And not just for Larry King, but also all of humanity. In fact, that singular event is the turning point of history. So why is Jesus' virgin birth so important? Well, the first reason that we'll look at is because it fulfills Bible prophecy. Let's begin with the Old Testament, Genesis 3:15. "And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He will bruise or crush your head, and you will bruise or strike his heel." The woman referred to here is Eve, and the "your seed" is a reference to the serpent, or Satan. After Adam and Eve disobeyed God and gave in to Satan's temptation as part of the consequences of their sin, God himself created active hatred or hostility between Satan and Eve, between his seed and hers. The seed of the woman refers to the future Messiah, Jesus, and all who would accept God's truth and receive forgiveness for their sin as an act of his grace through faith in Jesus. The seed of the serpent, Satan, refers to all who would ultimately reject God's truth and fall in with the lies and deceitful ways of Satan, or, in other words, all future unbelievers. In Genesis 3:15, we have our first hint of a virgin birth. The phrase "seed of the woman" is very interesting because it's a biological contradiction. In the context of human biology, the word seed in Hebrew typically represents the seed from a male. The word is tzerah. We all know that men have seed, or sperm. Women have eggs, or ovum. But God used the phrase "seed of the woman" rather than "seed of the man." God is very specific about language, and this particular phrase was intended to get the reader's attention because, in this case, if the seed would not come from man, if this was not the seed of a man, then where would the seed come from? This is a clue that the answer is from God himself. Has there been active hostility between the seed of the woman and the seed of the satanic serpent? Between good and evil, between followers of God's way, truth, and life, and Satan's ways? This is where it all began. This brings us to Matthew 1. This marks the beginning of the end of Satan's ways, and where God's way, his truth and life, was about to be made manifest to the world in the person of Jesus. First, some background. I want to show you that these accounts are historically and culturally accurate. Why is that important? Because it adds to the veracity of Jesus' miraculous birth. If all the other historical and cultural details in the Gospels are accurate, of which there are dozens upon dozens, why would the authors of these Gospels, who were so meticulous in recording historical and cultural details, then turn around and make up or outright lie about Jesus' birth? Let's start by looking at Matthew's account of Jesus' birth. Now, the birth of Jesus Christ took place in this way. When his mother, Mary, had been betrothed to Joseph, before they came together, she was found to be with child from the Holy Spirit. And her husband Joseph, being a just man and unwilling to put her to shame, resolved to divorce her quietly. Now, betrothal in ancient Israel was not like how we look at a couple being engaged today. The betrothal period could last up to 2 years, sometimes even longer. But the couple was considered technically married, except that they would not live together or be sexually intimate. During the betrothal period, the groom would go to prepare a place for them to live. In Jesus' time, this was called an insula. which was a cluster of buildings where extended families lived together. These clusters were built around a central courtyard. Grandparents, parents, cousins, uncles, and aunts all lived together and interacted together in the family insula. During the betrothal period, a son, the groom-to-be, built onto or added a room to the family insula. After asking a girl to marry him, the son would return to his village and build a new room or rooms onto his father's house. The son then waited for the day when his father declared that the building was complete and ready for the couple to move into. Then the groom would go collect his bride, and there would be a rather noisy and celebratory wedding procession to the son's village, at which time the couple would be officially married, and he would bring her to their new home. Now, the wedding date was entirely up to the groom's father. If this sounds familiar at all, I encourage you to read John 14, verses 1 through 3, and then read Mark chapter 13, verse 32. After that, compare that with Matthew 24:35 and Acts 1, verse 7. So, when Joseph considered divorcing Mary, it's because of the fact that betrothal meant that they were technically considered to be legally married. To cancel the betrothal, a legal divorce was required. They couldn't just call it off. There was a legal process that had to be completed. Plus, it may have been that Joseph had already begun building or maybe even completed room onto his family's insula. Now, this was all historically and culturally normal in first century Israel. This was no tale based on some pagan mythology. Let's continue. But as Joseph was considering these things, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David, do not fear to take Mary as your wife, for that which is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. So, when the angel appeared to Joseph, the effect of what he said was, don't be afraid to complete the marriage process and officially make her your wife. For the child she is carrying was not conceived by a man, but by God through the Holy Spirit. Now, here's where the hint from Genesis 3:15 comes in. The seed of the woman was brought into being by the Holy Spirit. This was an act of God, not man. Mary was the passive recipient of God's miraculous act. This has nothing to do with a sexual act between God and Mary, as some cults suggest. This was the partial fulfillment of what God promised in Genesis 3:15. She will bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. Let's look at that. You shall call his name Jesus. There's something that we miss here in the English version. It's a play on the Hebrew word Yasha. Yasha is the root word for both Yeshua and Yoshia. Why is that important? Well, Jesus' Hebrew name is Yeshua, which is short for Yehoshua, and Yehoshua means God will save. Yehoshua is the Hebrew name translated as Joshua in the English. So Yeshua actually means salvation. So what Joseph would have heard is something like this. She will bear a son, and you shall call his name Yeshua, for he will Yoshia his people from their sins. Now Joseph would have not missed the significance of the play on words here. To make this more palatable to our English ears, we might put it this way. She shall bear a son, and you shall call his name Salvation, for he will save his people from their sins. Just as a reminder of what Jesus has done for us, the next time you read the name Jesus in the New Testament or hear it, substitute the word salvation. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel. Now, Matthew 1:23 is a direct reference to Isaiah 7:14. Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. Matthew, and particularly Joseph, would have understood what the angel was talking about. And Matthew, this would have been God brought this to his mind through the Holy Spirit when writing his gospel. Now, in Isaiah 7:14, the Hebrew word for virgin is alma. And before we look at that word, it's important to keep in mind that Isaiah is writing about a supernatural event of great significance to the house of David. This is a supernatural event. This is not a normal event. This is not caused by natural causes. Now, when taken in the larger context of Isaiah chapters 7 through 11, we can see how Isaiah 7:14 was taken to be a messianic prophecy. Matthew had good reason to cite this verse when mentioning the birth of Jesus as the Messiah. Now, let's look at the Isaiah verse in its context, which was written more than 700 years before Jesus' birth. At that time, the people of Judah, or the southern kingdom, were being attacked by Israel, the northern kingdom, who were joined by the Aramean army. The combined armies were headed toward Jerusalem. Their goal was to take the city and replace the king, who was a descendant of King David, and place their own king on David's throne, thus disrupting the promise made to David, and also going back to Genesis 3:15. Now, if you remember, God had promised there would be a descendant on David's throne forever. So the Israelites had the northern kingdom had totally abandoned God. So this was an all-out assault on God's established dynasty and promise from which the Messiah would come. It was an attempt by Satan to eliminate the bloodline of David, which would also eliminate the possibility of the Messiah. Tragically, the current king of Judah at that time, King Ahaz, had also forsaken God. So the Lord sent the prophet Isaiah to speak to King Ahaz and urge him to put his trust in God alone and to assure him that Judah's enemies would be defeated. To show Ahaz that God would defeat Judah's enemies, God told Ahaz to ask him for a sign, that David's line would be preserved as promised. In verse 11 it says, "Ask a sign of the Lord your God. Let it be deep as Sheol and high as heaven." But King Ahaz said, "I will not ask, and I will not put the Lord to the test." Now, on the surface, that sounds all righteous and good and everything, but what Ahaz did was refuse to ask the Lord for a sign. So God said he would give him a sign himself. Ahab stubbornly refused to obey God. And that brings us to Isaiah 7:14. Let's go back again and look at it. "Therefore the Lord himself would give you a sign. Behold, the virgin will conceive and shall bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel." Now, since Ahaz refused to ask God for a sign, God provided the sign himself. Now, the question is here, what we need to look at. What do we need to look at? What's the supernatural sign that God would give? There are many proposed answers to that question that people have come up with over the centuries. But what we need to see is that it is the Lord himself who is giving the sign, which means it's coming from God, it's coming from the Lord. It's something that would grab attention, something out of the ordinary, something that could not be explained away by natural causes, something supernatural. So what's the sign? The virgin shall conceive and bear a son. And now let's go back and look at that Hebrew word that I mentioned before, alma. Does the Hebrew word alma mean virgin, as it's often translated? Well, its basic meaning is primarily related to adolescence, not sexual chastity. Adolescence in the sense of a young, unmarried maiden. That's the primary meaning. Now, before you start calling me a heretic, please keep watching. Some versions of the Bible translate this word as young maiden, which is technically more accurate. But there is a masculine equivalent to Alma. Alma is in the feminine, but this word is one that will illustrate what I'm talking about, namely LM, which means youth or young man, with no reference at all to virginity. Yet the root is the same as Alma, but only here we have the masculine form, LM. Okay, so let's look at a couple of passages to illustrate. And the king said, "Inquire whose son the male virgin is." There's our word, male virgin. 1 Samuel 17:56. Now, no one talks like that, not even in ancient Hebrew. What he's asking was, who's the youth? Whose son is this youth? Or whose son is this young man? Then there's 1 Samuel 20, verse 22. But if I say to the male virgin, there's our word again, "Look, the arrows are beyond you, then go, for the Lord has sent you away." Once again, that doesn't make much sense. LM just means youth or young man here. So LM and Alma do not specifically always mean virgin. Now, so how are we to take this word then in Isaiah 7:14? First, Alma is only used 6 times in the entire Old Testament. 4 times it is translated young maiden. However, Alma is never used in such a way that would describe a young maiden who is not a virgin. And that's never used to describe an older woman who is a virgin. Now, that's possible to have an older woman who is a virgin. Though it often does mean young maiden, the implication is always that she has never been sexually intimate with a man. Now, some critics say that if Isaiah wanted to specifically mean a sexually chaste woman, a young maiden, he would have used the word Betula. However, while this word often refers to a virgin in the Hebrew Scriptures, more often than not, it also has no reference to virginity and simply means young woman or maiden of marriageable age. In fact, in one Jewish translation of the Hebrew Bible, out of the 50 times Betula occurs, 31 times it is translated as young woman or maiden. So that's basically 3 out of 5 times. Now, that's from the New Jewish Publication Society version. So that's, a Jewish Bible, a Jewish translation of the Hebrew Bible. So even though critics say that Isaiah would have used the word Betula if he was specifically referring to a young woman who was sexually chaste, as we've just seen, that's not always necessarily the case. Now, in Genesis 24, both of these words, plus one more, are used when referring to Rebekah, who would become Isaac's wife. So let's see if I can help you make sense of all this. In the first half of verse 14, it says, "Let the young woman to whom I shall say, 'Please let down your jar that I may drink.'" Now, the Hebrew word for young woman is na'ara, or girl. Now, in verse 16, the young woman, na'ara, was very attractive in appearance, a maiden, Betula, whom no man had known. She went down to the spring and filled her jar and came up. Now, in some translations of this verse, the word maiden, Betula, is translated virgin. However, the following phrase that comes right after that is, "whom no man had known." If we translate young maiden as virgin was very attractive in appearance, and then say, the young woman was very attractive in appearance, a maiden or a virgin whom no man had known, That's kind of redundant, isn't it? It would read, a virgin whom no man had known. So, maiden, in this case, is a better translation for Betula. It makes more sense. A maiden whom no man had known, instead of a virgin whom no man had known, which would be a little redundant. And verse 43, this kind of sums everything up. It says, behold, I am standing by the spring of water. Let the virgin, Alma, who comes out to draw water, to whom I shall say, please give me a little water from your jar to drink. Here, Alma, as we can see, is translated virgin. Now, what's happening here is this. First, in verse 14, Rebecca is described as a na'ara, a girl or a young woman. Second, in verse 16, she is described as a young woman or a maiden of marriageable age, whom no man had known. And now in verse 43, she's described as a virgin. In this case, virgin is used in such a way, it's kind of a summation of who Rebecca is. A young woman, a maiden whom no man had known. In other words, she is a young woman of marriageable age who is sexually chaste. So what we see in Isaiah 7:14 is the same thing, is a young woman of marriageable age who is sexually chaste. Now, keep in mind, this is not just any virgin. There would have been, no doubt, many virgins in that day. So saying a virgin will conceive really doesn't make sense as being the sign from God. But the verse doesn't say just a virgin. Isaiah specifically calls her the virgin. The young woman is a special, unique virgin. In fact, she may have been known as the virgin, not only because of sexual purity, but also a purity of heart, purity of mind, and possibly one who was also especially devout. Now here's another twist that helps us. Over 200 years before the birth of Jesus, the Jews translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek. That translation is known as the Septuagint. The word they used to translate Alma from Greek into Hebrew was Parthenos, which also carries the meaning of a young woman who is sexually pure. In Matthew 1, Parthenos is the word that he uses for virgin. It's also the word that was used to translate from Hebrew to Greek, virgin, in Isaiah 7:14. This is why the Holy Spirit inspired Matthew to use Isaiah 7:14 to describe Jesus' miraculous birth. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel. In other words, Jesus' birth would be the ultimate fulfillment of Isaiah's prophetic words. So going back to our opening question, why is Jesus' virgin birth so important? Well, the first reason, as we have just looked at, is because it fulfills Bible prophecy. Going back to the very first blog I posted, we learned that God created the universe out of nothing. That's the greatest miracle ever. So if God could do that, then he could certainly miraculously cause a young maiden of marriageable age who had never known a man to conceive a child. Do you remember the question that Larry King would ask Jesus if he could? He said, I would like to ask him if he was indeed virgin born. The answer to that question would define history for me. Well, he's exactly right. The answer to that question does indeed define history. Next time, we'll explore some more of the why and how when we look at the virgin birth and the deity of Jesus. As always, thanks again for watching, folks. Thanks for watching Equip 412. I pray that you are encouraged and growing in your faith and walk with the Lord, and that you are learning. So I ask you, please check out our website at equip412.com. Also, please leave a question or comment, although be kind and courteous and considerate. So until next time, in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect. May the Lord abundantly bless you, friends, and I pray you will join me next time. Hope to see you then.